It's been another bad day for US stocks, with markets dropping again on Tuesday amid uncertainty caused by US President Donald Trump's sweeping trade tariffs.
The announcement of sweeping tariffs by newly elected US President Donald Trump sent shockwaves across the global economic landscape. Amidst his staunch campaign rhetoric promising to put America first and revitalize domestic manufacturing, Trump's swift move to impose aggressive tariffs on trade partners materialized into a dramatic policy shift. Almost immediately, China, the United States' largest trading partner, retaliated in a stunning and historic fashion. It announced a total cessation of all imports from the United States. This marked a seismic rupture in modern global trade, effectively severing the world's two largest economies from one another in one of the most comprehensive trade breakups ever witnessed. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The background of these tensions lies in Trump's long-standing skepticism of globalization and free trade, which he has criticized as having hollowed out the American industrial base. His tariffs, introduced under the guise of national security and economic revival, targeted a broad array of goods, from steel and aluminum to electronics and agricultural products. China, interpreting these measures as deeply antagonistic and discriminatory, responded with an unambiguous and decisive policy of economic decoupling, a blanket halt on all American imports. This move was not a mere tit-for-tat response. It was an emphatic geopolitical statement and a strategic realignment. China's decision was momentous, not only in its scope, but also in its signaling. Cutting off all U.S. imports amounted to an abandonment of decades of interdependence. The modern economic relationship between China and the U.S. had evolved since the late 20th century into a deeply intertwined structure. American firms relied heavily on access to Chinese markets, and China depended on American technology, agricultural produce, and capital goods. This mutual reliance had long been seen as a stabilizing force between the two superpowers. With a single policy announcement, China unraveled this bond, turning a page on the economic globalization that defined the post-Cold War era. The implications rippled instantly through global markets. Commodities that once freely flowed across the Pacific found themselves stranded in ports or redirected at a loss. American farmers, once heavily reliant on Chinese demand for soybeans, pork, and dairy, saw their export orders vanish overnight. Tractors stood still on fields ready for harvest that now had nowhere to go. At the same time, high-tech manufacturers, especially those producing semiconductors and advanced electronics, were suddenly locked out of one of their largest markets. Wall Street responded with steep sell-offs as investors reeled from the magnitude of the disruption. China's decision wasn't impulsive. It reflected a deep recalibration of its economic strategy. Rather than continuing to rely on a trade relationship fraught with political hostility, Chinese policymakers appeared ready to double down on self-reliance and regional integration. The move signaled a pivot toward alternative suppliers and markets across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It also suggested an acceleration in China's efforts to develop indigenous technology, agriculture, and manufacturing capabilities to replace American imports. In essence, China decided to weather short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term strategic autonomy. This decoupling also reshaped global supply chains almost overnight. American components and goods that once played a vital role in Chinese assembly lines and production processes were quickly being phased out. Chinese companies began sourcing alternatives from within their borders or from more politically stable trade partners. Countries such as Germany, South Korea, and Brazil found themselves in a scramble to fill the gap left by the U.S., suddenly thrust into new roles as preferred suppliers. Meanwhile, multinational corporations that had depended on fluid cross-Pacific trade flows were forced to rethink their logistics, procurement strategies, and market forecasts. For American businesses, the impact was both immediate and staggering. Export-oriented industries that had spent years cultivating Chinese customers saw their prospects erased. Automakers, aerospace firms, pharmaceutical companies, and even tech giants were cut off from a market of 1.4 billion consumers. Boardrooms across the U.S. erupted into emergency sessions to assess the consequences. For some firms, this loss was existential. For others, it necessitated a fundamental rethinking of their international strategy. The United States, once positioned as a key beneficiary of globalization, was now at risk of becoming isolated from the economic engine that powered the 21st century. Beyond commerce, this rupture also carried significant political weight. The move by China to halt all U.S. imports was not just economic retaliation, it was a declaration of disapproval and resistance. It suggested that China was unwilling to be a passive participant in a trade framework dictated unilaterally by the United States. Trump's actions were viewed in Beijing not as economic policy, but as an act of coercion. The zero import response was designed to send a message not just to Washington, but to the world. China would not be bullied into submission. It would chart its own economic destiny, even if that meant enduring economic turbulence. The Chinese public, long attuned to narratives of national pride and resistance to foreign pressure, largely rallied behind the government's decision. State media highlighted the move as a demonstration of sovereignty and strength. The ban on American imports became a point of nationalistic pride, framed as a rejection of unfair treatment and a declaration of economic independence. Domestic campaigns encouraged consumers to buy Chinese-made products and support local businesses. The Chinese government, in turn, intensified efforts to subsidize industries most affected by the sudden withdrawal of U.S. goods, from agriculture to semiconductors. On the diplomatic front, this abrupt trade divorce reshaped alliances and strategic calculations. Countries caught between the economic pull of China and the political influence of the United States faced difficult decisions. Some sought to remain neutral, while others began reassessing their alignments. The trade order established in the aftermath of World War II, built around multilateralism and U.S. leadership, was now under visible strain. China's move challenged the U.S.-centric model of globalization and invited others to consider alternative systems of commerce and cooperation. In many capitals around the world, policymakers began contemplating how to navigate a new era where economic alliances could no longer be taken for granted. While Trump's tariffs may have aimed to correct perceived imbalances and revive American industries, the cost of provoking China into full disengagement was immense. Economic decoupling on such a scale defied historical precedent. The last time the world saw this level of abrupt economic disengagement between major powers was during periods of war or ideological rupture. In peacetime, the decision by China to halt all U.S. imports stood out as a bold and destabilizing move. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, influence, and the future architecture of global relations. This dramatic turn also exposed the vulnerabilities of overdependence in trade. American farmers and industrialists who had come to rely on predictable Chinese demand were now confronted with a painful lesson. Global trade, however profitable, is also precarious when it hinges on fragile political consensus. Decades of investment, diplomacy, and economic integration were effectively undone in a matter of weeks. American infrastructure built to serve Chinese markets, railways, ports, storage facilities, suddenly became underutilized assets. At the same time, entire communities in agricultural heartlands and industrial zones were plunged into uncertainty. In China, while some industries scrambled to find new suppliers and suffered temporary shortages, the overarching sentiment from leadership was one of resolve. The disruption was framed not as a setback, but as an opportunity to push forward long-sought reforms. If anything, the cutoff from American imports catalyzed an acceleration of self-sufficiency initiatives that had already been brewing. From building domestic semiconductor fabs to launching large-scale agricultural modernization programs, China began putting in place structural changes to ensure that it could thrive without relying on American inputs. Geopolitically, the moment also marked a turning point in U.S.-China relations. The competition between the two powers had simmered for years, manifesting in disputes over technology, military influence, and global norms. With trade now added to the list of battlegrounds, the rivalry took on a new and more confrontational tone. The veneer of economic interdependence that had long masked strategic tensions was now gone. This breakdown signaled that the economic glue binding the nations had been stripped away, exposing a raw contest for global leadership. This development further complicated the role of multinational corporations, many of which had staked their futures on the U.S.-China corridor. Companies that had built entire strategies around dual market access, producing in China, selling in the US, and vice versa, found themselves at a dead end. Dual supply chains, diversification strategies, and onshoring policies suddenly became urgent corporate priorities. Boardroom conversations shifted from growth to resilience. Risk officers, once peripheral players, now found themselves at the center of executive decision-making. The broader message to the global business community was unambiguous. Political risk is now an inseparable part of global trade. For decades, businesses had operated under the assumption that economic logic would always triumph over political discord. China's decisive break with American imports shattered that illusion. It showed that nations, especially powerful ones, were willing to endure significant economic costs to assert sovereignty and resist coercion. The global order, shaped by trade agreements and market integration, was no longer as stable or predictable as many had believed. Culturally, the rift also influenced public opinion. In the US, nationalist rhetoric intensified, and blame for the economic fallout quickly became a political football. Rural communities, particularly those dependent on exports, felt betrayed by policies they had supported. In urban centers where high-tech industries faced sudden layoffs or restructuring, frustration mounted. Meanwhile, in China, the event reinforced narratives of Western antagonism and fueled a growing sense of national identity built on economic resilience. The historical scale of this economic disengagement also prompted intense academic debate. Economists began revisiting theories of comparative advantage and the benefits of globalization in a world where geopolitics could override rational markets. Political scientists studied the unfolding events as a textbook case of economic nationalism and great power competition. Analysts debated whether this was the dawn of a new Cold War, not ideological but commercial in nature, where economic blocs would form along political lines rather than economic efficiencies. While the full ramifications of China's decision to halt all U.S. imports would unfold in the years ahead, the immediate impact was unmistakably disruptive. Markets trembled, supply chains fractured, and strategic recalibrations were initiated across the globe. What had begun as a campaign promise transformed into a catalyst for one of the most profound shifts in international trade dynamics in modern history. At the heart of it was a clear and unavoidable message. In an age of rising nationalism, economic relationships are no longer immune to political rupture. Trump's tariffs, once envisioned as a pressure tactic, had instead triggered a realignment with unpredictable consequences. The world watched as two economic titans stepped away from a shared table that had defined the global economy for a generation. In the absence of cooperation, uncertainty reigned. Nations, industries, and communities were left to navigate a new and unfamiliar world, one marked not by shared growth, but by strategic separation. The full cessation of U.S. imports by China following Donald Trump's tariff imposition was not merely an abrupt reaction. It was a calculated pivot with far-reaching implications that reverberated across every major continent. With this singular move, China set into motion a reconfiguration of the global trade map, deliberately disengaging from what had been one of the most lucrative bilateral relationships in the modern economic era. As the world scrambled to comprehend the scale and consequence of this decision, the true depth of the event began to unfold in industries, institutions, and geopolitical strategies far beyond the immediate context of tariffs and goods. At the heart of this rupture was a transformation of mindset in Beijing. Chinese policymakers had long understood that their country's ascent as a global power would eventually face resistance. Trump's tariffs, sweeping, nationalistic, and imposed without broad international coordination, provided the final justification for a shift in direction that many in China's strategic circles had already envisioned. The pivot away from U.S. imports was framed internally not only as a necessity, but as an opportunity to reinforce China's sovereign development model. This was not a retreat from globalization, but rather a redefinition of it, where global economic integration would no longer require entanglement with a potentially hostile superpower. This redirection also played out in the digital and technological sphere. With U.S. imports blocked, China's dependence on American semiconductors, networking equipment, and data infrastructure came under intense scrutiny. Almost overnight, Chinese firms began accelerating their R&D investments to localize production. New industrial parks were announced, University partnerships expanded, and state subsidies poured into advanced manufacturing initiatives. The goal was clear: eliminate the need for U.S. technology by nurturing a fully independent supply chain, from raw materials to finished devices. The Made in China brand was no longer just about low-cost production. It now signified a new era of indigenous innovation. China's state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and national champions played a pivotal role in this transformation. Entities like Huawei, Sinopec, and CRRC were instructed to phase out U.S. components and replace them with domestic or third-country alternatives. These companies, already experienced in navigating geopolitical headwinds, became the testing grounds for a decoupled industrial strategy. In parallel, private sector giants like Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance shifted procurement strategies, redirected investment into domestic suppliers, and expanded operations in countries with stable trade relations. These shifts were not reactive measures, they were structural overhauls. In tandem, China ramped up diplomatic engagements across the developing world. With U.S. imports off the table, Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) gained renewed urgency and direction. The Chinese government began offering trade deals, infrastructure financing, and technology transfers to countries willing to deepen economic ties. Ports, highways, and power plants emerged across Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe with increased Chinese involvement. In return, China secured access to a range of goods and resources it once imported from the U.S. This realignment wasn't just about trade flows. It was about building a new global coalition that could operate outside of Washington's influence. Meanwhile, the international financial system began to feel the aftershocks. Traditionally, U.S. goods were priced in dollars and transactions were cleared through dollar-dominated institutions. China's rejection of U.S. imports also entailed a move away from the dollar in trade settlements. The Chinese central bank began aggressively promoting the yuan in bilateral agreements, offering currency swaps and establishing yuan clearing centers in foreign markets. Over time, this initiative began to erode the dollar's dominance in certain segments of international trade, laying the groundwork for a parallel financial ecosystem. The economic shift also had powerful implications for global logistics. Ocean carriers, freight forwarders, and port operators had to rapidly adjust to changing patterns. Routes that once linked the Pacific Rim with the western U.S. began losing relevance. Instead, shipping companies began focusing on Southern Hemisphere corridors and Eurasian land bridges. The China-Europe Railway Express gained momentum as a viable alternative to maritime shipping, supported by both logistical necessity and geopolitical will. Air freight followed a similar pattern, with more cargo flights now originating from or destined to cities beyond the U.S. orbit. In the domestic Chinese economy, the policy unleashed a wave of innovation and localization. Small and medium-sized enterprises (SMEs) were incentivized to fill the vacuum left by American goods. For example, in agriculture, Chinese biotech firms stepped up efforts to develop high-yield seed varieties to reduce dependence on American agricultural genetics. In healthcare, domestic pharmaceutical companies rushed to expand generic production and clinical trials to substitute U.S.-made drugs. Even luxury consumer goods, long dominated by American brands, saw a surge in local alternatives, as domestic companies began to invest in branding, design, and international expansion. Chinese academia and research institutions also saw a boost in state support. Funding for STEM disciplines surged, new research parks were commissioned, and international partnerships were refocused on countries aligned with China's new trade outlook. The government set ambitious targets for scientific output, aiming to become self-sufficient not just in production, but in innovation. The import ban thus became a catalyst for intellectual transformation, as the country repositioned itself not merely as a manufacturing hub, but as a cradle of advanced knowledge and discovery. Beyond economics, cultural and psychological effects took hold. Chinese media, always closely aligned with state narratives, began reorienting public perception. American products, once aspirational symbols of modernity, were increasingly portrayed as unnecessary, unreliable, or politically compromised. Instead, local alternatives were celebrated, and nationalist themes of self-reliance were emphasized across films, advertisements, and public campaigns. Schools revised curricula to include elements of economic patriotism, and university students were encouraged to pursue careers in domestic innovation and public service. In global politics, alliances began to subtly shift. Countries historically close to the US but heavily reliant on Chinese trade, such as South Korea, Australia, and members of the European Union, found themselves in delicate positions. Many adopted a strategy of strategic ambiguity, seeking to maintain economic ties with China while politically aligning with the US. But others, particularly those in the developing world, saw opportunity. Nations in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America welcomed the surge in Chinese investment and trade engagement, often with fewer political conditions than those attached to Western deals. The World Trade Organization, WTO, already strained by years of stalemates and uneven compliance, was thrown into further crisis. China's total cessation of U.S. imports, while arguably legal under certain retaliation clauses, effectively bypassed the spirit of the multilateral system. As disputes piled up and countries took sides, the WTO's relevance began to erode. Efforts to reform the institution gained little traction in the face of this unprecedented power struggle. In many ways, the global trade system was reverting to a multipolar state, with regional blocs and bilateral deals overtaking universal rules. In the United States, the repercussions continued to mount. Entire sectors began lobbying for exemptions, rollbacks, or compensatory measures. Congress was inundated with testimonies from affected industries, ranging from aerospace to almond farming. State governors in export-heavy regions called for urgent federal intervention, while Wall Street recalibrated valuations and earnings forecasts to reflect the loss of the Chinese market. The Federal Reserve faced mounting pressure to respond to economic instability, yet its tools were ill-suited to manage a politically driven trade decoupling. At the grassroots level, American workers bore the brunt of the upheaval. Job losses mounted in states dependent on exports. The ripple effects touched everything from truck drivers and dock workers to engineers and software developers tied to export-oriented services. Community banks in rural areas faced rising defaults as agricultural revenues collapsed. Small businesses that had built supply chains or customer bases in China struggled to pivot. The sense of dislocation was not just economic, it was emotional, as a generation of entrepreneurs and workers saw their business models suddenly invalidated by geopolitical rivalry. Academia and think tanks in the US engaged in urgent policy debates about how to respond. Some argued for a complete realignment, urging the U.S. to double down on domestic production and regional trade networks. Others cautioned against isolationism, warning that decoupling from China would only accelerate its ascent. Competing blueprints emerged for technological independence, agricultural resilience, and supply chain diversification. Government agencies scrambled to update forecasts, conduct scenario planning, and identify strategic vulnerabilities. The event also sparked a wave of legal challenges. U.S. companies contested the tariffs, arguing that they were arbitrary or had caused disproportionate harm. Trade lawyers found themselves flooded with cases, from breach of contract disputes to intellectual property questions. Courts, unaccustomed to adjudicating such geopolitically charged economic issues, were pushed into unfamiliar territory. Some judges sided with business interests, while others deferred to executive authority. The legal landscape became as uncertain as the economic one. As China forged ahead with its new trade trajectory, the country's leadership began articulating a long-term vision, one that framed the rupture not as an anomaly, but as a historical inevitability. State speeches referenced the century of humiliation and the imperative to never again be vulnerable to foreign pressure. The U.S. was no longer seen as a model or a partner, but as a rival to be strategically outmaneuvered. Trade policy, foreign affairs, technology, education, and even military preparedness were all integrated into this grand vision of autonomy. This reframing had a contagious effect in other parts of the world. India, often caught between Chinese assertiveness and American expectations, began investing more heavily in its own supply chain independence. The European Union accelerated talks about digital sovereignty and green industrial policy, aiming to reduce reliance on both superpowers. Russia and China deepened their coordination on energy and infrastructure. Countries in Central Asia found themselves courted by new powers as East-West trade flows rerouted. Over time, the full impact of China's decision would continue to evolve. Supply chains, once thought immutable, proved surprisingly malleable. New trading hubs emerged, new standards were written, and new economic philosophies took root. The binary simplicity of a US-led order gave way to a complex, fluid multipolarity, where national interests, security concerns, and cultural affinities played equal roles to economic logic. The age of predictability of container ships gliding seamlessly between Los Angeles and Shanghai was over. What emerged in its place was an era defined by uncertainty, but also creativity. Countries and companies were forced to innovate, adapt, and reimagine their place in a reshaped world. The decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, catalyzed by one of the most radical trade ruptures in history, had broken the mold. What had seemed impossible, a full halt of imports between the world's two largest economies, had not only happened, but had launched a new epoch in global affairs. Would you like this content formatted into a downloadable document or organized for publishing? As the trade curtain fell between the United States and China, the global economy moved into a phase of redefinition. With the two most powerful economies no longer engaging in direct commerce, a vacuum opened that invited new regional and global dynamics. For decades, the economic stability of the world had rested in large part on the interlocking systems of US-China trade. Their disengagement now set off a chain reaction, forcing governments, corporations, institutions, and even individuals to reorient expectations and operational models. The rupture's most immediate global consequence was a rapid acceleration of regionalization. Countries began prioritizing trade within their immediate geographical blocks, seeking to reduce vulnerability to distant geopolitical friction. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, emerged as a primary hub of economic energy, its member states finding themselves suddenly courted by both Washington and Beijing. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia in particular experienced a flood of investment as multinational corporations looked to rebuild manufacturing and distribution networks outside of China, but still within proximity to its markets. Latin America, previously under-leveraged in global manufacturing, found itself repositioned as a strategic supplier. With China turning away from American goods, Latin American economies took on an enhanced role. Brazil and Argentina surged as agricultural exporters, while Chile's mining sector, rich in lithium and copper, became a key resource hub for China's renewable energy and technology ambitions. These countries began retooling infrastructure, expanding ports, and investing in logistics corridors to meet the demands of an invigorated Chinese trade relationship. New trade agreements, tariffs reductions, and long-term supply contracts flowed in quickly, reshaping South America's economic identity. The shock of China's move also ignited new conversations around trade resilience. Governments that had traditionally depended on open global markets realized they needed buffers against future shocks. Sovereign wealth funds began allocating more capital toward domestic infrastructure and strategic industries. National security councils in countries like Germany, Japan, and India started conducting systematic reviews of their economic vulnerabilities. This shift led to the birth of a new kind of nationalism, not based solely on culture or politics, but on economic self-sufficiency and supply chain autonomy. This development had a marked impact on international institutions. Global trade organizations, economic forums, and even the International Monetary Fund faced an identity crisis. With two dominant economies pursuing diverging paths and pulling regional blocs with them, traditional frameworks for cooperation became increasingly irrelevant. Institutions built on consensus suddenly found themselves dealing with fragmentation. Instead of universal trade rules, bilateral and trilateral deals emerged as the new norm. This move toward minilateralism underscored the practical limitations of the post-war multilateral system in an era dominated by great power rivalry. The digital landscape also transformed in the wake of the split. The decoupling led to the solidification of two competing technology ecosystems. US-based cloud services, chip makers, and software platforms were systematically excluded from Chinese enterprise, prompting Beijing to double down on its own digital infrastructure. Meanwhile, American allies were encouraged to erect barriers against Chinese tech firms, especially in areas like 5G infrastructure, data security, and artificial intelligence. The tech divide became so stark that international firms had to choose between incompatible platforms, data regulations, and consumer behaviors based on their primary market alignment. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on China ditching all US imports after Trump's tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.